How about now? Yeah. Okay. I'm delighted to introduce our guest tonight for a number of reasons. Martin and I go back, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. Tonight's guest is Martin Hogue, and Martin is currently teaching landscape architecture at this is a mouthful, the College of Environmental Science and Forestry at the State University of New York at Syracuse. SUNY ESF, that's the shorter way of saying it. Martin is trained as both an architect and a landscape architect from McGill University and Harvard, respectively. I first met Martin about 7 or 8 years ago when he applied for a faculty position at IIT, where I was running the landscape architecture program. And I think probably some of my colleagues have had this experience before on a search committee when you open up a dossier and then you immediately start salivating uncontrollably. And that was the case for me. Everything in Martin's application displayed intelligence, creativity, and enviable skill, both as an architect and a landscape architect, but also as a graphic designer and, last but not least at all, his teaching. But perhaps it's Martin's quirkiness that I really like that draws me to him, his way of kind of bird-dogging hidden or neglected subjects that didn't seem to merit scrutiny until Martin got a hold of them. And I think that's what really sets him apart. One of my favorite examples of that is reconsidering Gordon Matta-Clark's fake estates, which was kind of a minor project in Gordon Matta-Clark. This is an artist who, if you don't know about him, you should look him up. Good for architects to know about Gordon Matta-Clark. So Gordon Matta-Clark bought a bunch of very, very tiny sites. He found these sites on Manhattan. For instance, some were 2.3 feet by 355 feet, or 1.3 feet by 1.11 feet. And he bought these for $25 each. And Martin got interested in this project, and he didn't just document the project. That would be too easy. So he used it as really a springboard for his own work, and he, I don't know, found hundreds, thousands? Oh, you're going to talk about it? Okay. Many, many more sites, and turned it into a really amazing project in the end with a fantastic exhibit that hopefully he'll show you. Another example is what Martin's going to be talking, I think, mostly about tonight, which is the exhibit that's out in the room outside here. 925,000 campsites. If you've already seen it, I assume Martin's obsessive research, his ability to take a seemingly mundane subject and reframe it to reveal its unconsidered significance, and again, his talents with diagramming and mapping impressed you. Those of you who haven't seen it, it's going to be up through the end of this month, till the new year, and you should definitely go see it, and I advise you to take your time. It's full of interesting information and amazingly kind of dense graphics. So it's kind of a slow cook thing, not a quick fry. I would also recommend that you listen to Martin's interview, which I think was on Monday or Tuesday on Michigan Radio, the NPR station here, and it's Stateside with Cynthia Canty, for those of you who listen to NPR. It's a program that's about Michigan-centric people and events and stories, and Martin's exhibit really fits that actually quite well. I mean, the campsite project is a national thing, but in fact it's really fits well into Michigan's it's appropriate that he's here for a couple of reasons. One is that, did you know that Michigan has more campsites than any other state in the United States? In fact, more than multiple states. It has 13,500, which is more than there are along the entire Pacific West Coast. Take that, Martin. From the northern tip of Washington State to the southernmost corner of California. And of course, most people drive to their campsites these days. So, automobiles are a thing. It's our state's most, largest crop, if you want to call it that. So finally, I'd be remiss, now this is too bad because this was my performance piece when I was going to hold up this item, that Martin has a book that's just recently been published by the MIT Press. It's called 34 Campgrounds. And those of you who are Ed Ruscha fans might think of Ed Ruscha's 34 Parking Lots. And it's just hot off the press, just in time for holiday shopping. So you can, it'd be a great gift for your favorite outdoor enthusiast. Anyway, and the last thing I would say is just Martin has a website with, again, a lot of fantastic projects that he's done through the years. It's just martinhogue.net, all right? So Martin, welcome to Lawrence Tech.
Thanks. That was great. All right, that was great. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I wanted to use the lecture this afternoon to give you, talk about the exhibition, but also to try to kind of frame it within the larger arc of my work over the last few years. And so I think whenever I talk about this project, I feel like I need to talk about more things because it's, can you hear me with the wireless mic? Yeah? Okay. Oh, thank you. Because I think it's a culmination of a lot of different sort of issues I've been working on in different projects, and so I think it helps to contextualize that work a little bit more. I think Peter and Deirdre has been really instrumental in getting the work here, and thank you so much. It's been really, the work looks great. I think the space is great. It's always nice to be able to not just show the work, but actually be able to talk about it also in person. So I want to talk about the kind of three major themes in terms of framing that larger arc of the research. And the first one is the importance that drawing has played in my own sort of education as a young architect and throughout my work over the last 30 years. It's really important to, I think for me, I realized this is 30 years this fall that I entered that I was a young architecture student, and one of the really particular kind of qualities or things I want to set up here at that particular moment in time is that digital representation had not yet gone mainstream. I think it was another maybe 10 years before it would do so. I remember at the GSD there were a couple of people like in a corner on a terminal doing all this quirky stuff, and we thought they were just kind of nuts. This is the kind of drawing everybody was interested in, everybody was sort of engaged in, and there was a materiality to the act of drawing at that particular point in the mid-'80s that for me is really truly the first real connection that I have to architecture as a discipline, as a practice. I loved everything about drawing. I loved the tools, I loved the paper, I love the kind of just being able to really understand how that stuff works, as smudging and all that kind of stuff was so important. And for me, the kind of act of drawing, the act of making through drawing is that first moment where I realized how passionate I was about this field. And again, it was my first real connection to the field. And it's interesting that there was a kind of use of multimedia at that point, using maps and photographs on top of more traditional mark making like lines and pencil on paper that has really kind of come back in a really interesting way in landscape representation over the last several years. And so it's really interesting to see that work has, how it has informed representation 30 years down the road. One thing I did learn, and I think this was a really important moment for me as well, the idea that drawings were not necessarily a means to an end. You don't make a drawing to get a building built, but that drawings could in themselves open up new worlds And the idea that the drawing is not a point of departure for built structure, but is a result in itself. And ideas could be explored and communicated through drawing. And that idea has always fascinated me, and I think for some of us in this room who are familiar with these projects, know that these projects are, in a way, as significant part of architectural discourse as any built project that has been built over the last 40 or 50 years. And for me, that was a really important influence, the ability to explore work through drawing as a kind of as an end in itself. I'm also very interested in the kind of internal logic of drawings. I'm fascinated with the kind of labor that it takes to read a drawing. I'm very always challenged by representations that are complex. And I want to find out more about them. And so I tend to, I've become a sort of inveterate scanner of stuff, like a collector of visual information. I scan hundreds, if not thousands of things every year. Some of these things are not necessarily part of the design field. They're not necessarily landscape drawings or architectural drawings, but they are just, I really admire them for the sort of elegance and the kind of clarity with which they present the ideas that they're trying to represent. So all of this stuff for me makes it into lectures at some point down the road, in studios and in representation classes. And so I think it's been a way for me to kind of talk about this work and process it, not only for myself, for my student as well. With respect to my own drawings, and I want to talk about a few of these projects this afternoon, I think drawing is at the center of my research practice. And I think drawing remains for me the most peaceful, intellectually, emotionally soothing thing that I do. Like I could sit at my laptop for hours and hours on end without ever feeling like I need to get out of my chair. And it's always amazes me that every project with every project come new opportunities for graphic representation. And I'm always amazed to see that projects or drawings never really look the same from one project to another. But the kinds of challenges of communicating information and studying ideas is something that I take great pleasure in. I just love drawing, and really, to me, that is the kind of thing that you need to kind of know about me coming into this work. In terms of my teaching, I wanted to include a couple of examples of some student work at ESF. These are some undergraduate student drawings. I have tried to use studio teaching as an extension of my own practice, and I try to share with my students not only a lot of visual information, trying to expose them to a lot of stuff out there, but also to instill in them a similar kind of passion for studying ideas graphically and for representing their ideas in graphic form. So I think I'm almost overwhelmed and humbled by the fact that some of these drawings, I wouldn't even know how to begin how to make these things. And so they are able to kind of take what I give them and really push it to a level that is completely beyond my own skills. And I think that's a really amazing thing in itself. So again, a couple of those examples here, but to me, I think teaching and research, there's a really great opportunity to extend one into the other here. Okay, the second idea I want to talk about, and this is a kind of narrative that explains a little bit my own transition as a young architecture student into interest about landscape architecture. And for me, the first real interesting sort of moment that really gets me interested in ideas about landscape is thinking about how buildings sit on the ground. Like that became a kind of a complete sort of obsession or fascination for a while, really looking at that threshold between architecture and landscape. And the way I started to kind of formulate those relationships was for me through this idea of the ground line, and really trying to visualize a series of important buildings and tried to understand how each of them engages the ground line as a kind of architectural space. At the same time, I want to make very clear that for me, I'm as influenced by ideas in architecture as I am in landscape, but also in art. And a lot of the work that I want to reference this afternoon are really art projects that toe the line between ideas about architecture and landscape as well. At that particular moment when I was interested in how buildings sit on the ground, I came across, for the first time, work of land artists from the late 1960s and the 70s. And I became really interested in the idea of not so much buildings sitting on the ground, but that the ground itself as a sort of inhabitable space. And that became a kind of way to begin to conceptualize that thinking about the ground line in an even more extensive way. So I think when you think about these last two land art projects that are on the far right over here, they, for me, sit very comfortably in that conceptualization of the ground line as some of these more sort of better known architectural pieces. And I think if you extend that ground line into some of the work that I've been doing over the last 10 or 15 years, I've started to realize that all of them in some way or another are interested in engaging that idea of the ground line also. So there's been a kind of extension into my own work. And I want to reference really briefly a couple of those projects here. One is research that I've done on the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah, which is some of you may know this site. It's a site that is naturally flat for miles and miles. It was a largely, extremely inhospitable landscape and largely uninhabited until the 1930s, before people started to figure out that you can race cars in this landscape really, really fast. There were no longer any roads on the planet that could sustain the kinds of speeds that these cars were going at. So this is the Bonneville Salt Flats is an area where car speeds in excess of 700 miles an hour have been achieved. So it's a really unique kind of a landscape, and I think its characteristic, its perfect flatness, make it an ideal place for this kind of racing to take place. And I'm really interested in the extreme flatness of it. Another project, this is a design project, which for me is a little bit unusual. I don't do a lot of design projects per se. This is a project called the Landing Strip, and it's a project that looks at the idea of gravity bringing this small plane onto the ground, and that particular point of contact between the earth and the sky, between the airplane and the ground, as an opportunity for a landscape intervention. And the site for this project is not unlike the site of the Bonneville Salt Flats. It's a pretty barren site, but it gives you kind of an idea of how that idea of the ground line starts to extend a little bit into other works and ideas. And I would think that the camping work that I've been involved in over the last few years is certainly part of that idea of the ground, or that interest in the ground line as well. I think the way in which campgrounds begin to commodify the ground itself as a kind of place into multiple individual sites seems to me a kind of an extension of that interest in the ground into this most recent work. So the third theme I want to talk about is, and I think this is, Peter, you touched on this, I think, in your intro, and I was really happy to hear your sense of that. I think you used the word quirky, and I think that's very much something that I've come to realize is part of most of the projects I've been involved in. And I want to make this argument that it's possible to do research really seriously, but also to have a sense of humor about what the work is actually about. And one of the projects that I, for me, think about when I try to think about this sort of the combination of lightheartedness and rigor is the Las Vegas studio from Venturi and Scott Brown, where Venturi and Scott Brown were teaching at Yale, and in the 70s they brought a number of their Yale students in architecture to Vegas to study the Las Vegas Strip. And to me, that seems like a completely crazy idea in itself, like the sort of highbrow Ivy League students, you know, on the Strip, studying the sort of lowbrow culture and the architectural, you know, merits of the Las Vegas Strip. And at the same time, the work that came out of the studio was incredibly rigorous and very, very serious, but taking, you know, I look at some of these drawings and I'm really amazed by the kind of care of the study, and at the same time you have to remind yourself that what they're looking at is a kind of driving strip. And so there's something both very lighthearted about this project and at the same time quite insightful. This is probably my favorite drawing to come out of the Las Vegas studio. This is a figure ground drawing of all the asphalt that is connected to the Las Vegas Strip, you know, directly. So just a drawing, I think, that would be completely at home in a studio these days, and I think bringing to bear a series of techniques that I've endured throughout the ages. These sort of dot, you know, mappings. You kind of have to look at the index to start to see the kind of humor of the project is really there, but it's done with really, really great care in a really, really thoughtful way. This is another drawing of the messages that are communicated when you're driving on the Strip, the kind of words that you're encountering. The words themselves are sized relative to the size of the text itself, the size of the sign as you're driving through. And some of the techniques that they brought to the analysis of the Las Vegas Strip, I think for the time were really innovative. I think nowadays you wouldn't think twice about turning on your phone when you're driving in your car, but I think putting a movie camera on top of the hood of your car and driving down the Strip to really study the way that it's experienced at full speed is an incredibly interesting and insightful kind of approach to studying. And I think some of the work that has come out of that, to me, is really innovative in its approach. But I think Peter talked about the fake estates. For me, as a young architecture student, if there's a single project that is absolutely the most important and marks the kind of biggest turning point in my education as an architect, this is the project that I would want to talk about. Matta-Clark is an artist who trained as an architect. He died at a very young age, at 35, in the mid-70s. This is one of his last works. Purchased at auction a series of lots in Queens that have been put up for auction for $25 a piece. You can see one of those lots here in red. These very quirky, very small lots. I loved when I came across, this is a photograph of the property here. This is a kind of deed to the property. What I loved about this project is how it's turned on its head the idea of the kind of functionality of the site. I think in architecture we think of a site as an empty lot on which you put a building. And he is saying, I mean, in a way, kind of turning that on its head, that these are real properties. It's real estate, and at the same time, there's humor even in the title of the project. It's not real estate, it's fake estate. But at the same time that he's kind of verifying the existence of these properties in a very serious way. Here's the deed, here are the maps, and so the sort of documentation of the site is very, very clear. A couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, I decided to pay homage to the fake estates by looking in the borough of Queens for similar properties that might be available. And what I found was actually properties that would make Matta-Clark's original fake estates look almost palatial in nature. I'm not sure if you've seen this yet, but this is my favorite lot. 1/8 of an inch by 110 feet in length. Like, you can't make this up. Like, this is real, right? This is absolutely real. And like, you just, every time I see that, I still smile at it. Like, there's a kind of verified, it exists in the kind of, in the records of properties of the city. So I think that begins to give you a little bit of a sense of the kind of humor of the project, or the quirkiness of the project, is these kinds of properties. And I think when it comes to the camping work, I would say that falls very much within that line of thinking as well. My wife and I, this is about as rustic as we've ever gotten as campers. You know, we buy our wood at the store in a box. You know, we don't cut our own wood. at our campsite. But this project does not come out of a deep passion for the outdoors. And I think it's really important to understand that for me, the kind of interest in camping is really connected to my first experience as a camper about 15 years ago when I checked into this KOA, and the attendant gave me a map of the campground, and he circled the lot and said, "Go camp here." And as an architect, I was completely taken aback by that. I guess I thought it would be a lot more informal, like go camp somewhere over there. And I think getting that map instantly, I knew there was something there I had to look into. And I think it's been something I've been able to study for the last several years. And I think what really interested me about camping is I think the disconnect that we have between the ideal that we have of ourselves when we go camping, which is in nature, we're communing with, with the outdoors, and the kind of reality on the ground, which is a pretty heavy-handed infrastructural landscape. And so I wanted to try to understand basically what had happened between these first campers in the Adirondacks around the time of the Civil War to the present time. And what is that transformation of that ideal about recreational camping in the US between these two images? And so if you look at the exhibition, I really hope you can understand that for me it's meant to be taken very seriously, but there's also a kind of lightheartedness to the topic that permeates the work. So the drawing's very serious at trying to make sense of the history and the evolution of the campground and camping in general, and at the same time that it's also meant to be taken in a kind of somewhat humorous way. I think I want to talk about one drawing here quickly. One drawing that for me embodies maybe some of that humor the best in this project is a kind of speculative situation here that I made up. I took some of the campers in this painting from the early time of the Adirondacks, and I sent them shopping to REI and trying to figure out what they might come out with. I think there's fascination with gear and campers. As a camper myself, I'm always catching myself looking at other campers and looking at the cool gear that they have and making notes of the next thing I need to go buy at the store. And so there's a kind of voyeuristic quality when you're a camper. You're always trying to pretend like people are not around you because it's going to kill your camping buzz. And at the same time, I think you're fascinated by how other people do it. So this image, I think, maybe best embodies that kind of, some of the more humorous side of the investigation. But I want to think that it's also should be received as a kind of serious piece of scholarship at the same time. So putting these three ideas together, what kind of work does that do? And I think for me, one of the things that's been really interesting is this back and forth between writing and drawing. And I think all of the projects that I do tend to integrate both traditional written work and also drawings as well. And I find in my own process that I kind of go back and forth a lot. I spend a couple of days on a drawing, then I'll drop that, I'll start writing about that drawing, I'll go back and forth. But a lot of these articles and projects are very deliberately meant to integrate both visual work of my own with more traditional scholarship as well. So if you're looking at an article, you're likely to find, say, as much space dedicated to drawings as you might to written work. Peter mentioned the 34 Campgrounds book that came out at MIT Press a couple weeks ago. I'm really psyched about this. It's been really a pleasure to work on this project. Some of the origins of the project are grounded in some of the exhibition work. If you've seen the exhibition, there is a part of the exhibit that looks at the way contemporary campgrounds look like, trying to combine imagery that is available online. None of the photographs here are taken by me, but these are photographs of campers that campers took and posted on like Flickr and so on. And this is a Google Earth view of the same facility. So trying to combine those to give you a sense of what the campground looks like. I was really wanting to extend that idea into this book. The title of the book is very literally a homage to Ruchet and down to the spelling of 34, which my editor fought me for a while. He wanted to spell it correctly. I wanted to spell it incorrectly, so there was no doubt that it was a connection to the Ruchet book. The Ruchet book, I wanted to make this sort of parallel between 34 parking lots and 34 campgrounds as really an examination of these two types of very generic settings in the American landscape. The Ruchet book delivers exactly what it promises on the cover. There are 34 photographs of empty parking lots in the LA area. And to me, it's always stunning to look at these photographs, not only because they're completely empty, so you're able to see these parking lots as for what they are. They're both incredibly specific and generic at the same time, and there's something really interesting about that. And so in the book, I wanted to bring a kind of similar examination to the idea of campgrounds in general. And one thing I wanted to that I learn about the exhibition is the idea that we make, how we make campsites. 150 years ago, these campers, hiked into the woods, created a site from scratch, a campsite from scratch. Since the 1930s and 40s, the campsites have been commodified in such a way that when you arrive at the campsite, you're given a map, you pick your own site, so it's much easier to create a campsite here than it is here. But it's become even easier in the last 10 or 15 years with online reservation websites that allow you to basically online shop for specific information about individual campsites. And so you're able to go onto these sites and look at photographs of individual sites, make a reservation several months in advance, all from the comfort of your home. So it's a very remote kind of experience, very disconnected from the actual place. And so what I wanted to do in this book is to basically aggregate all of these tiny photographs for 34 campgrounds across the country and start to kind of aggregate them in such a way that it provides this larger picture of the landscape in which these facilities are located. And there's something about these photographs that, there are about 6,500 of these photographs in the book that look both so much the same, and I think as you begin to look at the book more carefully, there's a kind of subtleties and textures that start to emerge from each of the pages that I think really begins to reward more patient viewing. I've been playing around recently with, I've been making these little short films. I've aggregated all of the photographs for these campgrounds at 6 campsites per second, and so the repetition starts to give you an idea of what it feels like to be looking at the book. A lot of these photographs, again, look very much the same, but there are very kind of subtle qualities that emerge out of these. Some of them, this one in particular, some of the campgrounds in the book are quite large, about 500 campsites, some of the largest in the country, and it becomes difficult to even, I mean, it's like a parking lot. It's almost like a parking lot, and it's the only specificity that you can have here is really about the number of the campsite in front. Some campgrounds that I've explored in the book are far more unique, but I think I wanted to show a kind of broad range of facilities that exist across the country. And of course, the exhibitions has been a kind of part of my research practice as well. I've been able to show a number of these research projects at various schools across the country for the last 15 years. The 925,000 campsites is the most extensive traveling that my work has done. I mean, this has been really terrific. It's traveled for the last 3 years, and I think this is the last showing. So it's also like a bittersweet moment of sorts. And I think with each installation comes the constraints of the room, and I think that's always been an interesting way to see how this system of panels start to adjust to different rooms. Most times I'm not able to be there for the installation myself, so I found myself thinking really carefully about specifying really carefully how I want the work to be installed. And so I found, even though the work for the exhibition was completed 3 years ago, since I think I've done as much drawing since then as I have for the exhibition. You guys have seen these drawings, how the crate should be packed and unpacked, how the panels are hung. And I think it speaks to the idea that it's not just the work on the panel, but how the work should be experienced by people in the galleries. I think really carefully about how I want the work to be organized and arranged around individual rooms. And so that's led to a lot of drawing, actually, for each of the installations. Each of these 13 installations has had its own set of drawings so that I could ensure that the work would be experienced in a very specific way. I think we've looked at like 63 different drawings so far, and that's a lot to handle in half an hour, even a little bit less. I thought one thing that could be interesting here is to kind of slow down a lot, and I wanted to maybe share with you the history of one specific drawing and how it came to be, all the decisions that went into this drawing, as a way to give you a little bit of insight into the way that I kind of work. And I think the drawing that I've chosen is part of the Fake Estates project, but I think there are a number of parallels with the camping work that I want to talk about at the end of the lecture. Matta-Clark, as I mentioned, trained as an architecture student at Cornell in the late 1960s, moved to New York, began his artistic practice at that point. Always a guy who operated on the margins of architecture, which I think is what makes him so interesting. He is best known for his very physical interventions in abandoned buildings, where he would really kind of take over with a chainsaw and start to carve with his chainsaw new relationships within the structures. So here you can see, this is probably his best known work, Splitting Four Corners, where he basically split an entire house in half and lowered the foundation on the side so it would sort of crack open to the sky. A really powerful move. I love the idea that in Matta-Clark's work, you're towing the line between accelerating the deterioration of the building, but at the same time, you're reinvigorating it with kind of new light and new space. And I think it's not hard to see how a project like this, the relationship with the Fake Estates is pretty clear. The kind of interest in the liminal, sort of super thin spaces is very much here. And certainly these projects are done at about the same time. And there's certainly between them also the relationship with this sort of interest in underappreciated structures and spaces in the city. So that's a little bit of the kind of background on his work. The Fake Estates is unique in that it's the only project in Matta-Clark's work that is documentary in nature, that it doesn't lead to a kind of physical intervention. There's a kind of short clip here that I want to show you of Matta-Clark himself visiting one of the Fake Estates that he had purchased at auction. The lot that he's purchased at auction, and you'll see it in the map here in a second, is a landlocked lot between other blocks. It's in the center of the city block.
Between lot 53 and 55. So the property is somewhere, the property would start somewhere 100 and, well, the full lot length is 100 feet to the very back. The property, we're going to have to locate the property 56.42 feet from this point back, okay? So it's back in that direction over there. Let's look in this one.
me out of the picture, please. I don't want to get in the picture. It's none of your business about it.
So it's really interesting that although the lot is clearly seen on the Sanborn map, when it comes time to actually verifying its presence in the complexity of the landscape of the block, it's much harder to see and to visualize. So this has been a really interesting experience because I myself, of course, had to go see some of these lots by myself. So I had these Sanborn maps, walking around and trying to see, and they are not so clearly identifiable when you're walking around the city. I'm standing basically on one of these lots that is just about as big as the footprint of my two sandals on the lot. I was able to experience for the first time the New York City property database, which is a really comprehensive database that basically every property in the city, all 1 million properties in the city are organized in the database. With the database itself, I was able to basically find out more information about the fake estates. You're able to basically browse on the property database by clicking specifically to the lot, the block number, the lot number, to find out more information about these 15 different lots that he had purchased at auction. New York City has 1 million properties that are organized chronologically in 5 boroughs. The borough of Queens, where the fake estates were purchased, has about 16,000 city blocks, and then about 360,000 properties. So that's a lot of different real estate. And so I was able to essentially go onto the database to find out more information about these individual fake estates. This one in particular, lot number 4-2497-42, which is one of the original fake estates, that when you type in those coordinates, it takes you directly to the information page on that site, and you have now information about its size, its cost, and so on. And I became intrigued with the idea to see whether I can use the database itself to research and see whether I could find other properties like the fake estates that would be nestled into the database. So what I decided quite naively to do is to basically start at the beginning. So I went at the beginning of the borough, block 1, lot 1, and I started there. And then I basically, because the lots are organized in chronological order, you can browse back and forth between adjacent lots by using your left and right arrows, as I am doing right now. This survey, so I basically kind of scanned through the entire borough of Queens, 360,000 clicks, one at a time. The most mind-numbing experience of my entire life. I mean, you can see as I'm browsing through here that the fields are really remaining the same. The numbers are changing and it's very easy to kind of lose track of this information as you're moving through. But my goal was to go through the database and to locate any property that would be valued under $10,000, which to me felt like if you have a property in Queens for that amount of money, it's probably a residual space of some sort. So again, the process of browsing took a very, very long time, and only once in a while do you come upon some of these finds I was talking about earlier in the lecture. For example, this particular lot, which was my favorite find, this lot that is 1/8 of an inch by 110 feet. People might wonder why these exist in the first place, and the short answer is that these are adjustments to earlier surveys that were never quite tight enough. So this is, you kind of make up for some of the gaps in the survey with these new properties like this one. And I think when I see this, I think to myself that probably means that every square inch of the city is accounted for somewhere. Like if the reading is so tight and so close, then it probably means that every square inch is part of a property. The survey itself led to about 1,800 lots that I found. I call these the fake estates, of course, a kind of play on words, that they're not the original fake estates, they're just a bunch of fake ones. But this particular drawing here is called lots under $2,000. It starts to give you an idea that there's quite a few of these properties out there that are across the borough. But for the most important drawing in the exhibition, I wanted to share with people just how different the city looks like when you're browsing in the database. When you're looking at a Sanborn Map Atlas, which is how people would used to look up information on sites, these atlases are huge books, and they're organized, they're kind of broken down in such a way that you are really only looking at a few blocks at a time. But there's a certain spatial coherence here that exists. You're looking at city blocks and buildings and lots. When you're in the database, for me, it's like analogous to looking at the city with a magnifying glass. You're so zoomed in that all you're seeing is a single block at a time. So I wanted to kind of maybe try to draw out what that might look like. When you're in the database, these properties are kind of individual fragments now, and you're browsing through them in chronological order, either backwards or forwards. And again, paying attention for each new click to the properties, the characteristics of the property itself. And then only once in a while do you come upon what I'm calling a fake estate, which for our purposes will be this one here, which is one of these sort of micro lots that are found in the fabric. What we've really done here is really just kind of traveled from here down the street to this block. But for me, it feels like that experience has been really stretched out. It feels so much longer when you're looking at it one block at a time. So if these properties could be put, if these 360,000 properties could be put end to end, it would make basically a single line that would be thousands of miles in length. That would start at the beginning, lot one, and end at the beginning, at the very, very last lot in the borough. So I wanted to do a kind of animation of what that line looks like in geographical terms. So this is a single line, but it's mapped out in terms of where it is geographically across the borough. Does that make sense? Right? So this line is, think of it as it's a 90-second animation that took 6 months to kind of really experience, one lot at a time. For me, one of the more interesting things about this is these, I think we're going to come upon one soon, these kind of major geographical jumps between, I think there's one right there. There, between 2 clicks in the database. One time you're Eastern Queen, 1 click later you're over here. But in the linearity of the database, all of them are spaced in the same manner. So you're able to kind of make your way very carefully, one lot at a time, one block at a time across the entire borough. LaGuardia is up here. There. And you can see that, JFK is there. JFK is like 7 properties. There's really, but they're huge. And LaGuardia, I believe, is somewhere around here. So it's a similar kind of breaking it down into very, very large lots. So in starting to lay out this drawing, the first elements that I laid out were these 2 equivalent representations, that this is the line in geographical terms, and this is an abstraction of that line. It's a single line. Each lot is assembled there in chronological order. Here's a kind of zoom into part of this line here that you can start to kind of see one lot at a time, but because of its chronological organization, all of them have a very specific space or place in the database. The next element that I added is the interface of the computer screen. So you're really now thinking about kind of 4 different ways in which you can look at that map, and then using a single lot that I was able to place geographically in each of the representations to kind of lock in the relationship between those elements. So when you look at the final drawing, those are the elements, the way that they were composed individually and then as a larger whole. And the drawing in the exhibition was really, really big. I think it gives an opportunity to really kind of almost walk into the drawing in a way that I know when I made it, I kind of zoomed into the computer screen in such a way that I could see things in such a fine-tuned way that I wanted to make the drawing as big as I could so that it could be experienced in a similar way. And it's certainly not, I think, the kind of quirkiness or the obsessiveness of this project, that of the 360,000 properties, it's certainly found its way into the camping research. It's not a stretch to even see how graphically these representations are analogous. So you're thinking about individual properties here, you're thinking about individual campsites, that I've started to realize that these projects are far more connected than I thought they actually were. With a student 3 years ago, we did a kind of inventory of basically all the campsites and all the campgrounds in the US. This is where the title of the exhibition comes from. This figure, 925,000 campsites, is a pretty precise accounting of all of the campsites, all of the campgrounds that we were able to identify across the country. And it really gives you an idea of how expansive that landscape of camping is across the country. And certainly when you think about the book, there's a kind of similar minutia in accounting for campgrounds, not as entire landscapes, but as a series of individual sites that can then be aggregated into these larger facilities. So I wanted to conclude here really briefly. When I was putting together this lecture over the last week, I was trying to come up with a title, and I think because of the kind of the recent titles that the 34 parking lots and the 34 campgrounds, I figured I might as well go all out and make the title of the lecture an expression of its contents. So this is where the 65 drawings comes from. But it really raised this really kind of thorny issue. It turned out to be much harder to count the images that I would associate as being drawings as I thought it was. I don't know if that makes sense. When I started to count on my slides, some of the question, like I would look at a slide and say, absolutely, this is a drawing, right? We all agree. These are two drawings. Like there's some of the slides were definitely not an issue, so they could be counted into the database. And if you looked at the lecture, there's this little index on each slide. This is not this is a drawing too. Some of them were not, hard to identify. But I think some of the kind of thornier issues with this word drawing started to come up, and they don't come up yet, but I think the sort of media stuff was never an issue that to me could be counted as a drawing. I even made the leap that I think drawings should not be defined by the disciplinary boundaries of design. So for me personally, when I think about this work, I counted this Pollock piece as one of the drawings in the lecture. I've encouraged students many, many times to re-engage their relationship with their tools in a way that the loss of control here is some of the stuff that I've explored with students. And so to me, that felt like that should actually be part of the lecture. It became a little bit thorny when when you're looking at these parking lots and these campgrounds. I decided I would count these only once. So the book or all of these is one thing. It's not 600, 6,500 images. So that was sort of clear. When I came across the fake estates, this was kind of really made me think a lot, because what I decided is that on the surface you can argue that there is Matta-Clark did not draw anything here. So one person might question whether this is a drawing or not. And to me, what why I decided to include it is that it had critical agency. And I think if a drawing doesn't have critical agency, for me, it's not a drawing. So when I look at a map like this, it's a beautiful map, but it has no critical agency. Like, it's just a map of a campground. And so I couldn't count that in there, even though I was fascinated with these kinds of maps. So I did not count that in there. And certainly, when it comes time to these sort of cinematic works and some of these pieces that are really blurring the boundaries, I wasn't quite sure. And I think what I decided at the end of the lecture, it was sort of too late to change the title, that maybe the word drawing is maybe not the more adequate word here. Maybe it's representations. I wasn't quite sure. But I wonder whether that term is just a kind of outdated term. And I just kind of leave that for you to ponder or to think about whether there are better terms to characterize the sort of visual investigations that we do in our work. So I wanted to leave maybe you with this question to think about. But it's for me, it was an opportunity to try to come to grips with that, and maybe I'll be able to think through that in the next few weeks. But it was sort of, this is where I was able to stop and to. So I thank you so much for coming, and if you have any questions, I'd love to be able to try to answer them or go back to some of the stuff you want to talk about. Thanks for coming. Thanks. The drawings of that project that he has done are, there are drawings of it that I've seen of the grid. It's 1 mile by 1 kilometer grid of these poles. They're very they're not underwhelming, but the project itself is so powerful that no one drawing can capture that. So I think try to draw that is almost impossible. But no, that would not be counted. So I think this is where I kind of came across each slide. Some of them are so easy and some of them are much harder to say. What do I mean when I say drawing? What am I talking about? And you would think that it's so clear, but it's to me, you would think after 30 years it becomes clear, but it's actually become more blurred. And that's good. I don't mind that, but I think the questions are much more gray. The answers are much more gray than now. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the lecture.
Thanks.
And kind of continue on the same line of questioning. Maybe I'm less obsessed with categorization if it's a drawing or not, but I really like how you call it kind of a critical agency or having a purpose
Right.
in the investigation or a critical idea to have to say about what you're investigating. And I wonder, this may be outside of your interest area, but obviously a lot of the students here and a lot of the faculty here work in visual modeling, heavily in visual modeling, and I will be one of those.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel strongly that drawings still matter and orthographic projections still matter. But most of my time in my own work I'm dealing in a three-dimensional virtual environment.
Yeah.
And so I've tried to find ways to force myself into kind of a projected plane on purpose, because I think it gives me information quickly that I don't get in any other view. And so it's not really a question, it's more of your thoughts on that. But you talked about a lot of data and a lot of critical imagery of that data that you created yourself that was critical. How would you advise a student that does work in models almost all the time, and how to extract that image out to make it valuable? Because it's like, I've even had colleagues say, well, drawings don't really matter, I have the whole model.
Right. No, I mean, I think this is a term that's starting to really, its meaning is starting to shift a great deal. And even when you think of a model, it's not a physical thing, right? It could be a digital thing. And that's where I find that these terms are much more ambiguous now that they might have been when I started. You know, the drawing was done in these kinds of ways, and that was very clear. I guess all I could say is that, and this has been, you know, collecting imagery and information, slides, I try to kind of process a lot of my own thinking through some of the lecture I give in my classes, and so I try to be really open-minded to what I find and sort of organize that stuff, and it becomes a way to process. And I want to, in a studio, I might show over the course of a semester, I don't know, 2,000 images. You know, I'm really hopeful if 10 of them stick with a student, that's great. They're not all meant to be absorbed in the same way, but I'm always so gratified when a student makes a reference to something like 4 or 5 weeks ago. There's one thing that they've just been trying to figure out. And so I think that it's important to give, I like to give students references that can help them to, you know, position their own work within the larger fields that are out there. And because I think that kind of true invention is almost, I don't know, I think it's really, really hard. So I think when I give these lectures, it's always in the hope that some of these things will stick and some of them may not. But I don't know if that answers your question a little bit, but it's trying to give them examples of how other people work, and then as a way for them to frame that, you know, relationship to their own.
Is it fair to say that, you know, there was one point in time where the action was inferred and the artifact was prioritized,
Mm-hmm.
right? So drawing
Mm-hmm.
was the noun thing and the verb thing was inferred.
Yep.
Modeling.
Yep.
And now, because there are many ways to come at the thing, the definition comes, the verb becomes more important perhaps than
Mm-hmm.
the noun.
Yes.
And so I wonder if that then talks about critical agency and kind of wraps up intent and all that. And I read in your work, and I guess this is where my question is, that your choice in the term drawing as opposed to modeling or mapping or representation or all the
Yeah.
other things that we associate is calling attention to the verb. And maybe your animation is what cards me a bit in this direction, but that it's that thing that matters. And
Mhm.
your intention is read in that. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, although it's funny because that animation was not part of the original exhibition, and it was only years later trying to talk about it again that I was struggling with I was looking at the drawing, I was pointing at it, but I wasn't able to illustrate that connection. So a lot of these things actually came much later than the exhibition as a way to try to explain what that process was. So actually that last piece of the lecture is really recent, even though the work itself was done 10 years ago. But I think that you're right about the kind of the verb. And I think that maybe the title of the lecture is deliberately, like I was trying to undermine that title at the end a little bit, but it's definitely starts to suggest to me that some of these words are much more difficult to ascribe to like a practice. You know, that there might be, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, but just whether there's other ways to characterize some of the work that we actually do. But I think that you're right about process. I mean, this is a lot of this kind of work I'm trying to do in studios, not so much dripping paint, but to have students engage their tools and their equipment in a way that's really unfamiliar, and so it kind of gives you, it takes the control away and it makes you discover new ways of operating. So that's been tried to not think of the artifact as the final thing, but really as the method of by which the work is made. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. I mean, my mind's wrapped in your first image, right, and I was acquainted with that as well, right?
Yeah.
You're sprawled out over a drawing, and your job was to keep your arm from smudging
Yep.
things that you've already drawn, and so you devised all of these pillows and apparatus to make that happen.
Yeah.
Right? And a fundamentally different set of actions now are prioritized within the field, right? Like that, right?
Yeah. You know where this is, right? This is this is a full-scale drawing of an airplane wing I guess is it Ford? It is Ford, right? So it is. They were, and yeah, you're kind of, you know, setting up camp on top of this drawing. It's such an amazing image.
Of putting pieces of paper and other things
Yeah.
down, or to get a curve, right? That poor gentleman on the corner, right? All of it. And it just seems to me that as you take those props and behaviors and other things away from the production, right? It kind of fundamentally changes one's attitude about the work, the thing that you're doing. Whereas the artifact might be very similar, right? We can make that, you just be printing it on a much larger sheet of paper.
Right. I mean, I still believe, and I think walking around the school, I think you guys do too, that it's that there's still value in learning to draw by hand. You know, I think I know a lot of people in some schools that never even go there. They go right into Rhino, right onto, you know. And I think for me, there's a certain value that still is there to engaging, you know, physically with the medium, with these kinds of tools, although it's always then trying to project forward and to, when you move into the digital realm, to try to compare these kinds of things and what's lost, what's gained between them. But I want these students to be able to have to be able to critically assess that in terms of, I mean, to me that first connection remains not at this scale, but I mean, it remains a kind of analog one. I don't know how to take that out of teaching. I don't think I'd be able to, actually. Even in 20 years, I'm not sure I'd be able to do that still, you know. I don't know. Does that make sense? That's a tough one. One of my favorite artifacts, one of my favorite tools is somebody gave me these you know, bankers, like these bracelets that you put on your sleeves just to raise your sleeves. That was just such an amazing thing. Like, I mean, I just love that, you know, that stuff, you don't do that anymore. It's really great. Anyway, sorry, I'm reminiscing a little too much. Thank you. That's great.